Welcome to Power in the Wind. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you have chosen to spend the next 30 minutes with my guest. In last week's program, we visited the Morgan Lewis Mill in St. Andrew, and Dr. Honeychurch detailed its working. For a better understanding of what occurred there, he used a replica of a sugar mill that, of course, is one of the exhibits to be found in the Sugar Museum at the Portville Sugar Factory. We were told about its interesting history and its mechanism and machinery, from vertical rollers to the horizontal rollers. We also took a brief look at the boiling houses and how they were used in the making of sugar. In this week's program, we shall take a look at the skilled workers and the tools they used around the plantation and in the mills. Dr. Honeychurch begins by looking at the oscillator.
So as the technology of the sugar industry developed, particularly from the early 19th century, what we get is the development of this little simple machine called an oscillator, which essentially oscillated. It turned the thick, almost crystallized sugar that had been boiled in the boilers, and it speeded up the creation of crystals. And this would be added to during the day. You would have people continually working on spinning this. And then in the evening, the remnants that were here, the very firm, almost crystallized sugar, would then be put into coolers and then transferred to the hogsheads, the barrels, and the sugar cones to be able to drain to create the sugar.
Not only were there workers who kept watch over the power in the wind in order to set the sails and begin the grinding of the sugar, there were also other specialized tasks as performed by the blacksmith.
The plantation was actually dependent on many skilled workers. Usually people think just of people cutting cane, laborers cutting cane and feeding mills. But you had the persons who were responsible for producing the sugar. Their skill, their knowledge in that was remarkable, and the plantation managers and owners were highly dependent on them. And in the days of slavery, their value as an individual was far more because of the skills that they had. Someone who was immensely important to the plantation was the blacksmith. Because we must understand that in those days, although a lot of materials were imported from Britain, ready-made, for instance, the cane bills from Birmingham and Manchester, with all designed specifically for the sugar industry. The tip there to bill, as it was, to pull the cane forward and then to turn and to cut the cane. It all was designed basically from here for the needs. And then the factories in the industrialized center of Britain produced them and sent them out. But they often need fixing and sharpening. Things such as hoes for digging the fields. Hoes were extremely important as well. Axes and adzes for various woodworking. And even these planes. The only thing that was imported into Barbados was the blade, and the rest of it was constructed by carpenters, and the blade was then slipped into here, hammered in. The actual blade itself was here. How far it stuck out was regulated by this piece of wood that was slipped in here, and then you made your plane. But as I say, you needed the skills to do all the rest of it, because only the blade here was what was imported into Barbados. And also a combination of woodwork and metalwork, another very important component, like the chassis of a modern truck, was actually these yokes for the oxen, particularly for the oxen who were bringing the cane out of the field or carrying any other thing around the plantation, carrying the barrels and hogsheads from the plantation to the seaports. All of this was dependent on the power of the oxen. And the oxen These yokes went around the neck of the ox, and then here you had a metal part which was attached this way between the two oxen to the cart. All of this, whenever it went wrong, had to be maintained by the blacksmith. So blacksmiths, very important, crucial to the manning and production of the mills and of sugar. And we must remember, in the case of windmills, all of those cogs, all of those rollers, the connection between them, it was the blacksmiths who actually were able to link all of these things together and repair them in conjunction with wheelwrights, the guys that made the wheels for all these carts, and the millwrights, who were responsible for the entire operation of the machinery of those mills. So all of these people came together as a team to operate these windmills, and later on the steam mills to a lesser extent. But as windmills required a lot of maintenance, you will find that these people as a team were key operators to maintain these, at one time, 508 mills around Barbados.
When we think of sugar, its byproducts and the way in which these were stored, barrels, puncheons and hogsheads do come to mind. But whose job was it to make these?
Hogsheads were the very much larger containers for sugar. Barrels for rum, all different sizes, puncheons, each of them had a different name. And they were dependent on this interesting combination of a person who could do some metal work but was also extremely skilled in woodwork. And he was called the cooper. He had to relate to the blacksmith and also to the carpenters on the plantation. But he produced these watertight barrels. You can see that they're slightly bent because they are actually ensuring that the tops, also made of wood, were secure, and that the rims were rammed down so that everything was held together. And when the moisture got in, whether it was the rum or brandy or other things, these would expand, and you had also to take this into account when you were constructing any of these. You also would have a hole to be able to have the bung, because that is how you got the liquid in and out. And the coopers and their equipment, of course, the metalwork part of it were these sections, the hoops, which had to be different sizes and slightly sloped in a way, this way, so that they could fit down snugly over the boards, which had been bent by smoking and heating very skillfully to be able to fit together. And all of these required a variety of tools. You see here this to go down in the bung, the dividers just simply to measure and to ensure that you've got those things correctly. All of these tools required for this very important skill on the plantation.
The specialized workers have done their job of making the sugar and the rum. The blacksmith in their repairing and maintenance of the mills. The coopers have built their barrels. Now it's time to transport the product to the waiting ships for export to England. One specialized device was the spider.
This amazing contraption, you can look at it with all its various parts and bits and pieces sticking out, and you can see why it was called the spider. Because you imagine a spider with all of its little feet and extensions in a similar way. You see the wheels, there is your barrel of sugar or rum, and this was operated by men, mainly in Bridgetown or in the plantation. You would not take a spider and bring it, 5, 6, 10 miles to the port. That was the business of the ox carts. The ox carts would basically bring this to the towns, whether it's Spikestown or Bridgetown. And then within the towns, the individual barrels or hogsheads would be moved around closer from the storerooms, because you had these big warehouses in places like Bridgetown, And then when the ships came in and they were ready for loading, you then brought them to the edge of the careenage to be put in the lighters, to be taken out to Carlisle Bay, and then to be loaded on the larger ships. Some cases you would have places like Consets and the Crane, where you would have small harbors for also loading on sugar. But essentially, Speightstown and Bridgetown were those main ports. To a certain extent, Oistins for the Christchurch area. But essentially, because it wasn't going far, but it really would be very difficult to move it totally by hand. It was basically up and down the streets and across onto the waterfront. Here you have this. I'm not going to shift it, but essentially it was for lifting up the barrel. You'd have it on the ground, you'd tie it around with a rope, and then you'd lift it, tuck it underneath here. It was off the ground. Then you lifted this up, as you see in many of the older photographs, and it is taken along. One man behind, 2, 3, or 4 men in the front holding this, dependent on how heavy it was and how large the barrel was. So another very detailed piece of equipment, used mainly in Barbados, but in all of the sugar islands up and down the Caribbean.
Those are just a few of the contraptions associated with the power in the wind. Rather, they became necessary because of the power in the wind. Though not around today, you can enjoy a glimpse of this special piece of the island's history and heritage when you visit the Frank Hudson Sugar Museum at Portville Factory in St. James. From the west, we head south, where Dr. Honeychurch examines the machinery and the mechanisms still intact in this 18th century sugar windmill.
Here we are at Lowland Plantation in Christchurch with a fantastic example of a centrally shafted windmill with all of the machinery in place, albeit that it's a bit rusty, but it gives us a clear idea of one of the windmills where everything is inside the mill wall. Although it is a horizontal mill with rollers lying horizontally, it still gives us an idea of what those early windmills were like when there was a straight shaft coming down and 3 rollers standing up. What is also very clear about this mill is you have got a definite entrance and exit. The entrance for the canes to come in, to be crushed into these rollers, and then the bagasse to go out the other arch on the other side, with this area for the collection of juice, and you would have the gutters going in this direction, bringing the crushed cane juice to the factory for processing either into sugar or into rum. The British Industrial Revolution benefits so much from the sugar industry of the British Caribbean. Here all over Barbados, you're going to find pieces of machinery with the names of the producers. In this case, George Fletcher and Company in London, sometimes in Derby, sometimes in Glasgow, producing this machinery for the crushing of cane. So you can imagine the factories in Britain that are pumping out manufactured goods in terms of these bits of machinery to be sent to the Caribbean, to be paid for by sugar, and to increase investment in the British Industrial Revolution. So here at Lowlands we have this horizontal mill, but unlike Morgan Lewis, it is not out in a separate shed. What we have here is a central shaft coming down, and the cogs are tied into this main wheel here, which then is sending the turning energy to these 3 rollers. And we know that these are 19th century because they are beginning to develop the actual indentations within the rollers of the mill. So essentially what they have done here is they have transformed a 3-roller, 3 upright vertical rollers. They have transformed it by new investment into the horizontal rollers, which were much more efficient, and especially those that had the indentations there so that you had teeth crushing the cane as well. And when we look up, we will see the connection from this central shaft right up into the the house up on top there, connected to the windmill itself. The breeze coming across Christchurch here from the east, turning the mill, and then turning this, connecting with the cogs to turn the rollers and crush the cane. A classic example of a Barbadian sugar mill in the 18th and 19th century.
So far we have discussed the workings around the plantation, including the skilled labor and the compensation money. Now, one of the most important structures on the plantation was the windmill used to crush the sugarcane. These had to be sturdy to withstand the pressure associated with the grinding and turning of the mill. Dr. Honeychurch now details the material used to build these structures. He begins at one of the earliest mills here in Barbados, situated on a summit overlooking the northwestern section of the island.
Yes. Arnold's Mill, overlooking the wide sweep of St. Peter and St. Lucie, in a prominent position, just where you want it, with the winds coming over the ridge there from St. Andrew, picking up across the level plateau here, and then sweeping out in this direction. A perfect location for one of the early mills where wind was of the essence. And here we can also see by the method of its construction that this was the very early days. This was before cut stone. This was rough blocks, pieces of coral pieced together with the coral limestone mortar putting it all. So if we look closely at the composition of this mill at Arnold's here, very early, we can actually see that what they're piecing together is a mixture of mortar and rough, uncut bits of coral rock that they have found in the gully. There's a gully very close to here, or even in the landscape which they're clearing for sugar. Another thing, and it's very educational here at Arnold, because we have in the record books the possibility that what they were doing is creating these windmill towers, these mill walls, by formwork, so that you would have formwork in a circle, and then they'd pack the stones and they'll pull the formwork higher up and then do it in stages. And here at Arnold's you actually find a level through here. So you can imagine that there's a big heavy duty wooden formwork here. They're packing in all of this mortar and this rough stone, and they reach a level which you can see here. And then they break this down and they construct another set of a wooden formwork, and they continue the process on. Because remember, if you were building a square building, of course you could use your spirit level and your line. But when you're doing something that is circular, you require something else. And it's more than likely that this formwork was used to pack all of this mortar. We can actually see some straight areas here where either a cut stone or a piece of wood was, and we can see it going up. The actual pieces of coral are also clear here. So it gives us an idea of how these mills were constructed. And we notice too that all the arches, the sections of cut stone, have been removed. And it was probable that later on in the mill's history, they came and cannibalized the mill, removed those cut stones, which were very important, very useful, very difficult to make, and then took them to use in another building, either another mill or even a plantation house. And so Arnold is left here at this spectacular location on top this ridge with most of the sections of both the arches removed. We will notice here, and this is another indication of how early it is, that they haven't developed multiple arches. They've just got this one central arch, and then over on the side one of these long thin arches for the bagasse to go out, probably also the juice, and for them to be able to put bits of timber, heavy duty long bits of timber, up into the mill to be able to do repairs. So it's a fine example of one of those from the beginning of the days of sugar, the very early mills that existed. And the name Arnold's Mill gives us an indication of its early construction as well, because the Arnolds were one of the first settler families that came here in the northern section of the island and established themselves. And we see that name featuring very early on in the history of Barbados. So by understanding the family name and its dates and times, we can also relate it to that very early period of this mill. And behind us, we can see the extent of the land that it controlled. So we get an idea of the prominence of this mill as one of the first in what became 508 sugar mills across the island when sugar really took off during the 18th century. So all in all, a landmark, very interesting educational tool to understand how these early mills were constructed. And it stands here rather like a sentinel looking across the landscape and to the sea beyond, a landmark not only on this landscape, but a landmark in the history of sugar in Barbados.
Our tour of the windmills continues right here in the parish of St. Peter as we look at another early mill in Barbados made of rubble stone. As you can see, it is situated here on the mound overlooking the Anglican Church of St. Philip the Less in Boscobel. Do bear in mind that these structures were constructed by the enslaved people. They are still standing today, having withstood hurricanes and other natural disasters.
Here at Boscobel, we have a fine example of a rubble-stoned windmill. And it has a lot of the very early features of the shorter windmills. You can see quite clearly almost entirely of rubble stone. Only where the arches are located are you going to get clay brick and in some cases cut coral stone, which in this case much of it has been removed. But the important feature of this is the long, narrow arch. And this was to enable repairs to take place when those huge pieces of timber had to be brought in to replace the rotten timbers up in the main part of the house up on the top where the sails stuck out. So to get that up inside there, they thought ahead and they constructed these long, narrow areas so that you could push the materials up. This has fallen apart, but there's still a significant amount of it available for us to understand the method of piecing together that rubble stone collected from the cliffs and put together with the mortar. Also inside, you can see where the beams were sunk into the wall for the different levels within the mill itself. And you would have your main beam going straight through to the cogs up in the house on the top here. Also, what you see inside here are the alcoves for the positioning of lanterns at night. So if there was work going on at night, you would be able to light up the area, and also ventilation, because we have at least two holes on the west side, one that is clearly visible, one that is demolished, and this allowed ventilation from all of the heat that was acting up here with the turning and crushing of the cane, and then also it allowed for light to come in to these different levels and to be able to help the people who were repairing all of the machinery up on top in the house on the top of the mill wall.
We leave the rubble stone mill wall here in Boscobel, St. Peter, and visit one in Christchurch which has a unique design.
In the early days of sugar mill construction, there was a lot of experimenting going on as to how to build the mill walls. And here at Gibbons Plantation, not far from Oistins and Enterprise, we have a very unique example, unusual in Barbados, of an octagonal sugar mill wall. Here, this 8-sided mill wall from the early period, because we know it's full of rubble stone, and also the brickwork is very early brick. It's not the 18th century brickwork. And we can see it in the arches of these buildings here. And the thing is that perhaps they had thought that it would be easier in construction because they used formwork to construct these mills. And so if you had a more angular mill, you would be able to shift the formwork up and up to be able to get the full height. And we can see inside here the various levels that they were using to construct it. Layers, it's very rough rubble type of coral stone, so it gives it an example of an early mill. But the different levels that they used to get up to the full height of the mill. And then when we look at the brickwork in the arches, it's very early flat brick. Not the 8-inch by 4-inch bricks that you usually find in 18th century sugar mills. And so it designates this as a rather early example, an early attempt at devising an appropriate sugar mill for the crushing of cane. But nobody seemed to follow on this, and that is why the vast majority, if not all the other mill walls in Barbados are actually round. Probably it had something to do with the aerodynamics of the breeze coming around the mill itself. But here at Gibbons, we have this example, which some people thought was so unusual that they sometimes referred to it as a cattle mill. But there's nothing about a cattle mill related to this. It was an attempt at constructing a different type, perhaps they thought a more efficient type of sugar windmill.
From the south, we have journeyed to the north to visit Bexy Bella. This is a good example of the adaptive reuse of a windmill. While it is not converted into a house or an office, it has nevertheless been used for water. And Dr. Honeychurch explains.
And here we are at Portland in St. Peter with a fine example of adaptive and appropriate technology in use. Over here we have a smaller windmill which is actually pumping water from way down below the coral crust and pumping water for use in the plantation. And then on the other side up here we have the main sugar mill, which is in the past was used for crushing the sugar cane, both utilizing the breeze that's coming across from the Atlantic across this plateau here in St. Peter. But there's another addition to the appropriate use of this technology in the past, in the way in which they would take the water from this mill here and then transfer it to a cistern in a pattern which could be used for watering the cattle, the horses and the oxen and the other animals that were required on the plantation. So let's go and take a look at the way in which they utilized this water that had been pumped by wind power, put in the cistern, and then used by the cattle for drinking. So here we have this large cistern, a tank, which is taking the water from the windmill that is pumping that natural water from way down into the coral crust. It's also collecting water from the roof, all coming into this cistern here, and then the water is overflowing into this trough, which is in a semicircle around the tank, and this is where the cattle that were working on the plantation, the oxen for the ox carts out in the field, the horses for the overseers and others to ride, all of these cattle and horses would come here and be able to drink their water from this trough. So at Annandale, we saw that after the mill had been decommissioned, was not used for crushing cane any longer, they constructed on top of it a belfry to be able to ring the bell for the hours of the plantation, start work, lunchtime, and end of work. Now there was a relationship between Portland here and Annandale. So what usually happened is Annandale would get equipment first. When it was being decommissioned or reused, it would come here to Portland. So the bell that we are seeing here is the first original bell from Annandale Plantation that is now being transferred to Portland. But we see the mill being used for the same purpose, a high tower where once the bell was ringing it could be heard throughout the plantation. And here with the date on it of 1952. A mill that, like many others around the island, had a name, and this one
is Betsy Bell.
And so from right here at Betsy Bella, we end this week's program of Power in the Wind. Do join us next week at the same time as we continue our look at these structures that were moved by the power in the wind. I'm Sherwood McCaskey.